Hidden cameras in the mountains. It was supposed to be a perfect weekend. My best friend Emma had rented this cozy cabin for her birthday, and the plan was simple. Good food, a few drinks, and no cell service to bother us. The drive up was long, winding through dense woods where the GPS signal kept dropping, but the place looked amazing when we finally got there. It was perched on a small hill, surrounded by towering trees that blocked out most of the sun. Inside, it was just as charming as the photos. Rustic furniture, a wood-burning stove, and a huge window in the living room overlooking the forest. The host, a guy named Alan, had left us a bottle of wine with a handwritten note wishing Emma a happy birthday. It seemed thoughtful at first, but something about the handwriting, too neat, almost robotic, made me uneasy. I shrugged it off. We were there to relax, after all. That first night was normal. We cooked dinner, played music, and drank a little too much. Around midnight, Emma suggested we explore the cabin more, since it had this creepy basement she was dying to check out. The stairs down were rickety, and the basement smelled like mildew and wet wood. It was mostly empty except for some old furniture and a few shelves lined with random tools. But as I passed by a shelf, something caught my eye. A small, blinking red light tucked behind a row of paint cans. I reached for it, pulling out a tiny camera. At first, I thought it was some leftover home security device, but why would it be pointed into the room instead of out? When I showed the others, it sparked this weird mix of laughter and unease. Emma joked that we were being spied on, but no one seemed too concerned. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The next morning, I woke up to a strange tapping sound. It was rhythmic, like someone lightly knocking on glass. At first, I thought it was one of the others messing around, but when I checked the window, there was no one there. The forest outside looked dead still. Shaking it off, I headed to the kitchen for coffee and found Emma staring at the living room window. "Look at this," she said, pointing to the sill. There were smudges, handprints, but not like ours. They were small, almost childlike, and the weird part was they were on the outside, high up, where no one should have been able to reach without a ladder. That's when I noticed something else. The curtains, which we had closed before bed, were now slightly open, as if someone had been peeking in. I tried to reason it away. Maybe the wind? But deep down, I didn't believe it. Later that day, we decided to investigate the rest of the cabin more thoroughly. I guess we were trying to reassure ourselves, make the place feel safe again. It was Emma who found the next camera, hidden in a vent in the bathroom. That was the moment things shifted. Up until then, it had been easy to joke or brush off the weirdness, but a camera in the bathroom? That was deliberate, invasive. We tore through the cabin after that, checking every corner, behind picture frames, under the furniture, even inside the fireplace. We found 3 more. One was tucked into a bookshelf in the living room, another was mounted in the smoke detector, and the last one was hidden in a clock in the bedroom Emma and I were sharing. By then, no one was laughing. Emma tried calling Alan, but the call wouldn't go through. Her voice was shaking as she told us, "We need to leave now." We started packing in a rush, throwing our stuff into bags without even bothering to fold anything. I couldn't stop glancing at the walls, half expecting another hidden camera to blink back at me. While Emma and I worked on clearing the bedrooms, Jake and Mia went out to load the car. A few minutes later, Jake came back inside, pale as a ghost. "The tires are slashed," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. For a second, no one reacted, as if the words didn't make sense. Then Emma bolted to the door to see for herself. Sure enough, all 4 tires on her SUV were shredded, deep gashes running through the rubber. It wasn't an accident. Someone had done it on purpose. "Who the hell would do this?" Mia whispered, her voice trembling. None of us had an answer. That's when Emma noticed something stuck under the windshield wiper. She yanked it free and held it up for us to see. A folded piece of paper with a message scrawled in the same unnervingly neat handwriting as Alan's welcome note. Smile for the camera. My stomach dropped. It wasn't just creepy, it was a threat. And whoever left it had been close enough to do it while we were still inside. Jake suggested we stay put and lock all the doors, but the thought of spending another second in that cabin made my skin crawl. Emma grabbed a fireplace poker, Mia found a kitchen knife, and we decided to hike down the road to see if we could get cell service or flag someone down for help. None of us wanted to split up, so we left the cabin behind, trudging down the dirt path with every nerve in my body screaming that someone, or something, was watching us. The hike down the road was agonizing. The dense forest seemed to press in on us from all sides, every snapping twig or rustling leaf making us jump. None of us spoke much, except to mutter the occasional, "Did you hear that?" or "Keep moving." My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was echoing in my ears. After about 10 minutes of walking, Emma's phone buzzed. 1 bar of signal. Relief washed over us as she dialed 911, but the call dropped almost immediately. She tried again, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped the phone, but it was no use. The signal flickered in and out, and all we could hear was static. "We just need to keep going," Jake said, his voice tense. "We'll hit service eventually." But the further we walked, the more the road seemed to stretch endlessly ahead, as if we weren't making any progress. Then we saw it. A car, parked in the middle of the road up ahead, half hidden by the trees. Relief turned to dread the closer we got. The car was empty, an old, beat-up sedan with its windows rolled down and no sign of its owner. As we approached, Emma stopped dead in her tracks, pointing to the windshield. Another note. This one was taped to the glass and read, "Don't leave before the party's over." I felt like I was going to be sick. It wasn't just the message, it was the fact that whoever left it knew we were trying to escape. Jake tried the car doors, but of course, they were locked, and the engine was cold. We had no choice but to keep moving. By then, the sun was starting to dip lower, casting long shadows across the road. Every step felt heavier, like we were walking into a trap. As the light faded, we finally reached a clearing where the road widened slightly. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something, movement in the trees ahead, like a figure darting out of sight. "Did you see that?" I whispered, clutching Emma's arm. She nodded, her face pale, but before she could say anything, Jake called out from a few steps ahead, "There's something here." He pointed to the side of the road, where a bundle of wires was snaking out of the dirt. It was connected to a small, boxy device half buried in the ground. Emma knelt to get a better look, and that's when we realized it was a camera. Not one like we'd found in the cabin. This one was weatherproof, camouflaged, and pointed straight at the road we were walking on. Someone had been watching this path, too. We didn't stick around to analyze it. Jake yanked the camera out of the ground, and we took off down the road, adrenaline overriding exhaustion. But the deeper we went, the more things felt wrong. It was as if the forest itself was changing, twisting around us. The road, which had been a clear dirt path earlier, now felt overgrown, the trees closing in tighter, their branches gnarled and almost menacing. That's when we heard it. The faint sound of a voice. It wasn't close, but it was distinct, a man's voice, low and steady, coming from somewhere off the road. We froze, all of us listening, trying to figure out where it was coming from. Then it stopped, replaced by a strange mechanical clicking noise that sent chills down my spine. We didn't wait to find out what it was. Without a word, we started running. The clicking noise followed us, faint but relentless, like someone winding up an old toy just out of sight. Every few seconds, one of us would glance back, but there was nothing, just shadows shifting between the trees. My legs were burning, and I could hear Emma wheezing behind me. Jake was the first to stop, doubling over and gasping for breath. "We can't keep going like this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. None of us argued. but stopping felt just as dangerous as running. We huddled together in the middle of the road, trying to catch our breath while scanning the woods around us. That's when I noticed something on the ground. Footprints. Not ours. These were deeper, spaced unevenly, as if whoever made them was dragging something. And they were fresh. Before I could say anything, Mia let out a muffled scream, pointing to something ahead of us. A trail camera, just like the one we'd found earlier, was mounted on a tree, its lens glinting faintly in the dim light. It wasn't just the camera that unnerved me, though. Beneath it, nailed to the tree, was another note. This one was scribbled messily, as if written in a hurry. "You can run, but you can't hide." My blood turned to ice. It wasn't just a game anymore, it felt like a hunt. Jake grabbed a rock and smashed the camera in one angry motion, but it didn't make me feel any safer. If anything, it felt like we'd just provoked whoever was out there. Without saying a word, we turned and kept moving, our pace slower now, fear dragging at our heels like quicksand. As we trudged forward, the forest around us seemed darker than it should have been, like the sun had set prematurely. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone emerge from the trees, but the only thing I saw was the ever-present shadow of our own fear. Emma clutched the fireplace poker so tightly her knuckles were white, and Mia was silently crying, trying to hide it but failing miserably. Jake was ahead of us, muttering to himself, like he was trying to convince himself this was all some elaborate prank. But deep down, we all knew better. This wasn't a joke. Someone was toying with us, and it felt like we were walking straight into their hands. We came to another clearing, but this one was different. There was something unnatural about it, the way the trees were spaced out, almost like a ring. In the middle of the clearing was a small wooden structure, barely more than a shack. It looked old, but not abandoned. Fresh tire tracks were pressed into the dirt around it, and the door was slightly ajar, creaking faintly in the breeze. "We shouldn't go near it," I said, my voice trembling, but Jake was already moving toward it. "If there's a phone or a radio in there, we can call for help," he reasoned. The rest of us hesitated, but the alternative, staying out in the open, felt just as dangerous. Reluctantly, we followed him, every step feeling heavier than the last. As we stepped inside, the air felt colder, like the shack was holding its breath. It was small, barely enough room for the four of us to stand, and filled with strange equipment. Monitors, wires, and what looked like recording devices stacked on a wooden table. The monitors were off, but one had a faint red light blinking in the corner. Mia gasped, pointing to a cluster of screens mounted on the wall. Each screen displayed live feeds from cameras around the cabin. The living room, the bedrooms, the bathroom. I felt my stomach churn as the realization hit. Someone had been watching us the entire time. Emma pressed her hands to her mouth, her face pale. "This is sick," she whispered. Jake was already yanking at the wires, trying to disable everything, but I wasn't sure it would matter. That's when we heard it, the sound of a car engine, faint but getting closer. Emma froze, looking at me with wide eyes. "It's him," she whispered. "It has to be him." Jake motioned for us to be quiet, and we scrambled to turn off the flashlights, plunging the shack into darkness. The sound of tires crunching over gravel grew louder, then stopped, just outside. A door slammed. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure whoever was out there could hear it. We didn't dare move, barely even breathed, as heavy footsteps approached the shack. They stopped just outside the door, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then, a slow, deliberate tapping on the wood, like whoever it was wanted us to know they were there. The tapping stopped, and the silence that followed was suffocating. My pulse was racing, every nerve in my body screaming to run, but there was nowhere to go. The shack had no back exit, just the door and a small window too high to climb through. The footsteps started again, this time circling the shack, slow and deliberate. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. They knew we were trapped. Mia let out a quiet sob, and I grabbed her hand, squeezing it to keep her calm. The monitors flickered for a split second, even though Jake had unplugged them, and that faint red light on the device blinked faster. It felt like we were being taunted, like this whole thing was a game we were losing. Then, the door creaked open, just an inch. My breath caught in my throat. We all froze, staring at the sliver of darkness beyond the threshold. A shadow shifted there, something indistinct but unmistakably human. I could feel Emma trembling next to me, the fireplace poker clutched so tightly in her hands it looked like she might snap it in two. The figure didn't move, didn't step inside, just stood there, as if waiting for us to make the first move. Jake grabbed a heavy piece of equipment from the table, ready to throw it, but before he could, the shadow retreated. The door creaked shut again, and the footsteps faded into the distance. It should have been a relief, but it wasn't. Whoever it was, they weren't gone. They were just waiting. We waited in silence for what felt like hours, but in reality, it was probably only minutes. None of us dared to speak or move, straining to hear any sign that the person, or people, were still outside. Eventually, Jake motioned toward the window, mouthing, "We need to go." He climbed onto the table beneath the window and peeked out, his face tense and pale. After a moment, he nodded. "I don't see anyone," he whispered. It wasn't much reassurance, but it was enough for us to act. Jake hoisted himself up and out first, and then helped Emma, Mia, and me follow. The ground outside felt strangely solid beneath my feet, like the air itself had been lighter inside the shack. We didn't run this time. We moved as quickly and quietly as we could, sticking to the trees instead of the road. The forest was darker than ever, the thick canopy blocking out what little moonlight there was. Every sound, branches cracking underfoot, the rustle of leaves, felt deafening. We didn't know where we were going, only that we had to get as far away from that shack as possible. After about 10 minutes of stumbling through the woods, Emma stopped suddenly, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "Look," she said, her voice barely audible. Ahead of us, just visible through the trees, was the cabin. Somehow, we'd circled back. Seeing the cabin again sent a wave of panic through all of us. "This doesn't make sense," Emma whispered, her voice shaking. Jake muttered something under his breath, pacing in tight circles like he was trying to figure out where we'd gone wrong. But it wasn't just confusion, it was dread. The cabin looked the same as when we'd left, except the front door was wide open now, and the lights inside were on. Someone was there. Mia grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "We can't go back," she said, her voice cracking. "We can't." None of us wanted to, but standing out there in the pitch-black forest felt just as dangerous. It was like being caught between two nightmares. Jake made the decision for us. "If they're inside, maybe the car keys are too," he said. His voice was firm, but I could see the fear in his eyes. "We get the keys, we get out of here." It wasn't a great plan, but we didn't have a better one. We approached the cabin cautiously, staying low and sticking to the shadows. Every step felt like it echoed, even though we were trying to be as quiet as possible. When we reached the porch, Jake peered inside, then motioned for us to follow. The living room was empty, but something was off. The furniture had been moved, chairs facing the large window, as if arranged for an audience. On the coffee table was a tablet, its screen glowing faintly. Jake picked it up, his hands shaking, and we all leaned in to see. It was a live feed of us, outside the cabin, walking toward the porch just moments earlier. The realization hit all at once. Whoever was doing this wasn't just watching us. They were steps ahead of us, controlling the situation like puppets on strings. Emma backed away, her breathing quick and shallow. "They're still here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake set the tablet down like it had burned him, his eyes darting around the room. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, even now. Every shadow in the corners felt alive, every creak of the floorboards like a signal. The tablet screen suddenly went dark, and then a single message appeared in bold, white text. "Look behind you." We didn't hesitate. Jake grabbed the poker from Emma, and we bolted for the door. Mia was screaming, a raw, panicked sound that made the hairs on my neck stand up. I could hear heavy footsteps somewhere behind us, too fast and too close. We barely made it out of the cabin before the lights inside flickered and went out completely. In the moonlight, I caught a glimpse of movement near the window, a silhouette just standing there, watching us. "Keep running," Jake shouted, his voice breaking. We tore down the driveway toward the main road, not caring about the noise we made anymore. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they were going to give out, but the thought of stopping was worse. The road was ahead, and for a split second, I thought we might make it. Then, from the trees beside us, that mechanical clicking noise started again. Closer this time. Louder. The clicking was relentless, growing louder and faster, echoing through the trees. It felt like it was surrounding us, closing in. I turned to see if anyone else was hearing it the way I was, but their expressions told me everything. Emma had tears streaming down her face, and Mia kept looking over her shoulder, her lips moving silently like she was praying. Jake didn't even glance back. He was focused on the road ahead, gripping the fireplace poker like it was the only thing keeping him together. I tried to keep up, but my foot caught on a root, and I went down hard. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and for a terrifying second, I couldn't move. Jake stopped and ran back to help me, hauling me to my feet. "Come on," he yelled, his voice cracking. That's when I saw it. Just beyond the trees, in the direction we had come from, there was a figure. Tall, thin, and completely still, its face obscured by shadow. But it wasn't just standing there, it was holding something. A camera. The lens glinted in the faint light as it tilted its head slightly, like it was studying us. Jake pulled me forward, and I forced my legs to move, even as the terror of what I'd seen pressed down on me like a weight. We didn't stop until we hit the road, but by then, something had shifted. The clicking had stopped. The air was deathly silent, but it didn't feel like safety. It felt like a trap waiting to spring. We stood there on the empty road, gasping for breath and scanning the shadows. It was eerily quiet, not even the sound of wind in the trees. "Do you hear that?" Mia asked, breaking the silence, her voice trembling. But there was nothing to hear. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. "We have to keep moving," Jake said, his voice firm but strained. None of us argued. Stopping felt like giving up. We stuck close together, every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves sending a fresh jolt of fear through us. Then, up ahead, we saw headlights, bright and blinding against the darkness. Relief flooded over me, and I almost cried. A car was coming toward us, slowly, but it didn't feel like an accident. The car stopped about 20 feet away, the high beams fixed on us like a spotlight. Nobody got out. The windows were tinted so dark we couldn't see who was inside. Jake held up the fireplace poker defensively, and Emma called out, "Help! Please, we need help." But the car didn't move. It just sat there, engine idling softly, while we stood frozen in its glare. Then the driver's side window rolled down just an inch, and something small was tossed onto the road in front of us. The car reversed slowly, its headlights fading into the night until it disappeared completely. Jake picked up what they had thrown, a simple Polaroid picture. When he turned it over, we all saw it at the same time. It was a photo of us, huddled together in the shack, terrified. And scrawled across the bottom in that same neat handwriting were 3 chilling words: "See you soon." We didn't stick around to think about it. Jake tossed the photo to the ground, and we started walking again. Faster this time, almost jogging. Every instinct was screaming at me to run, but we were too exhausted. It felt like every direction led us deeper into someone's twisted game. The car's retreat felt deliberate, as if whoever was driving wanted us to know they could have done more but chose not to. That Polaroid burned in my mind, the message repeating itself over and over. See you soon. It wasn't over. It might never be over. Finally, we saw something in the distance, a faint glow like lights from a building. It wasn't much, but it was enough to push us forward. When we reached it, we realized it was a gas station, dimly lit and completely deserted. The relief was overwhelming, even though the place seemed abandoned. There was a payphone near the entrance, and Jake sprinted for it, fumbling in his pockets for loose change. Emma banged on the locked glass doors, calling out for anyone inside, while Mia and I kept watch on the road, afraid the car, or worse, would come back. Jake finally got through to someone, his voice frantic as he explained where we were and what had happened. Just stay there, he kept repeating, nodding as if the dispatcher could see him. We'll wait here. Please hurry. The call ended, and for the first time in hours, I felt a flicker of hope. But then Mia grabbed my arm, her grip so tight it hurt. Look, she said, her voice barely audible. Across the road, partially hidden in the shadows of the forest, was that same figure, standing completely still, watching. It didn't move. The figure just stood there, as if it were waiting for something. My chest tightened, and I couldn't look away. It's them, Mia whispered, her voice shaking. Emma turned and saw it too, gasping audibly. Jake grabbed the fireplace poker again, positioning himself between us and the road like it would make a difference. Stay together, he said, his voice low but firm. None of us moved, too scared to even breathe loudly. The figure tilted its head slightly, like it was acknowledging us, and then raised something to its face. A camera. The flash went off, bright and blinding in the darkness, freezing the moment like a grotesque photograph. When my vision cleared, the figure was gone. It didn't retreat into the woods. It didn't cross the road. It just vanished, leaving us staring into the empty trees. Jake muttered a curse under his breath, pacing in a tight circle. This isn't real. This can't be real, he kept saying, but none of us had the strength to respond. Moments later, we heard a faint sound in the distance, the rumble of an engine. The police. I should have felt relieved, but all I could feel was a sick sense of dread, like this wasn't the end. It was just another part of their game. 2 squad cars pulled into the gas station, their flashing lights casting long shadows across the lot. A wave of shaky relief swept through us, but it was muted, overshadowed by the lingering fear. The officers stepped out cautiously, hands near their holsters, and started asking questions. Emma tried to explain everything, about the cameras, the notes, the figure in the woods, but the words spilled out in a chaotic blur. One of the officers raised his hand to calm her down. We'll check it out, he said, his tone professional but skeptical. I could tell they didn't believe us. Not fully. Maybe they thought we were drunk or paranoid, but they promised to escort us back to the cabin to investigate. Riding back felt like a death sentence. The woods loomed larger in the flashing red and blue lights, the shadows twisting unnaturally. When we arrived, the cabin was completely dark, just as we had left it. The officers searched it thoroughly, finding the cameras exactly where we had described. They agreed it was suspicious, but their reassurances rang hollow. We'll file a report and contact the property owner, one of them said, as if that would somehow fix everything. They didn't find any trace of the figure, the car, or the Polaroids. It was like none of it had ever happened. You're safe now, the officer added. But deep down, I knew we weren't. The drive home the next morning was silent. None of us wanted to talk about what we'd seen, and even if we did, how could we explain it? We left that cabin, but the feeling of being watched never left us. Sometimes I still feel it, that creeping sensation, like a camera lens focusing on me from somewhere unseen. I haven't been able to sleep properly since, and I haven't stepped foot near a forest. Whoever, or whatever, was out there, they weren't just watching us. They were waiting. Ritualistic neighbors. I'm Sam, 32, living with my partner, Rachel, in a small, quiet town in Vermont. Our house sits on the edge of a wooded area, with the kind of charm you'd expect from an old New England home. Creaky floors, drafty windows, and an overgrown backyard we're always saying we'll fix up. Life was peaceful, routine. I work remotely as a graphic designer, and Rachel runs a small bakery in town. The house next door had recently been converted into an Airbnb, which at first seemed fine. Mostly tourists coming and going for the scenery. But last spring, something happened that still keeps me up at night. It was a Friday, and I'd been wrapping up work for the day while Rachel was prepping for a weekend catering event. Around dusk, a white van pulled up next door, and a group of 4 people got out. 2 men and 2 women, all dressed in these long, dark coats, despite the warm weather. They carried no visible luggage, just a few old-looking wooden boxes. Normally, we'd wave or say hi to guests, but something about them made me hesitate. They didn't look like the usual hikers or leaf peepers. Rachel peeked out the window and said, "They look like they stepped out of some weird Victorian play." I laughed, but deep down, I felt uneasy. That night, as we settled into bed, strange noises drifted through the open window. At first, I thought it was music, maybe someone playing a flute or a recorder. But it didn't sound like music. It was off-key, almost metallic, with long, droning notes that set my teeth on edge. Then came the chanting, low, rhythmic, and in a language I couldn't place. I got up to look outside, but their curtains were drawn tight, and the only light came from this faint, flickering glow, like candles or a small fire. Rachel muttered something about weird Airbnb types and went back to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next morning, I tried to brush it off as nothing. People do weird things on vacation, right? Maybe they were into some kind of historical reenactment or meditation retreat. But as I stepped outside to water the plants, I noticed something strange. Near the edge of our yard, close to the Airbnb property line, were these small, circular symbols drawn in the dirt. They were intricate, with jagged lines and swirls that seemed almost intentional. At first, I thought it was kids messing around, but then I spotted something even weirder, a bundle of twigs tied together with red string lying right in the middle of the symbols. I called Rachel over, and she frowned as she looked at the markings. "That's unsettling," she said, kicking the bundle lightly with her shoe. "Who does this?" Neither of us had an answer. We decided to leave it alone, figuring it was harmless, albeit creepy. Still, a part of me wanted to march over to the Airbnb and ask them about it. But what was I going to say? "Hey, did you guys do some kind of witchcraft in my yard?" It felt ridiculous, so I let it go, for the moment. That evening, things escalated. Around 10 p.m., the same eerie noises started up again, this time louder. I could hear faint drumming, followed by that same chanting. It didn't sound celebratory. It sounded heavy, intentional. I tried to convince myself it was just part of some bizarre ritual they were doing for fun, but then Rachel gasped and pointed out the window. In the dim light from their yard, I could make out the 4 of them standing in a circle, swaying in unison. They were holding hands and appeared to be chanting toward a wooden box placed in the center of their circle. It looked like one of the boxes they'd carried in the night before. "What the hell is going on?" Rachel whispered, gripping my arm. I didn't have an answer. I just stood there, frozen, watching as one of them opened the box and pulled out what looked like a small, writhing object. A snake? No, it wasn't moving like an animal. Whatever it was, I didn't want to find out. I yanked the curtains shut and locked the door, trying to shake off the creeping dread crawling up my spine. We barely slept that night. I kept imagining those symbols, the tied twigs, and whatever they'd pulled out of that box. Rachel suggested calling the property owner, but it felt premature. What would I even say? Instead, we decided to keep a closer eye on them. The next day, I made a point of stepping into our yard more often, pretending to work on random tasks like fixing a loose fence post or sweeping the patio, hoping to catch them outside. But their blinds stayed drawn, and the house was eerily quiet. No laughter, no casual chatter, none of the usual sounds you'd expect from a group on vacation. Around mid-afternoon, I noticed something off. The symbols from the day before weren't just still there, they'd been added to. More circles, more intricate designs, spreading closer to our side of the yard. This time, I didn't hesitate. I walked straight up to their driveway and knocked on the front door, rehearsing some polite version of "what's going on" in my head. But no one answered. The house was silent, despite their van still being parked outside. I knocked again, harder this time, feeling my nerves fray with every passing second. Still nothing. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath. That night, Rachel and I decided to stay up late, determined to figure out what these people were up to. We turned off all the lights and sat by the window, peeking out through a crack in the curtain. At first, everything was still. The house next door was dark and quiet, and I started to feel a little ridiculous for getting so worked up. But then, just past midnight, they emerged. All four of them, dressed in those same dark coats, carrying lanterns that cast an eerie orange glow over their faces. This time, they didn't stay in their yard. They walked straight toward ours. Rachel grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Sam," she whispered, her voice trembling, "they're coming here." I didn't respond, too frozen to move. We watched as they stepped into our yard, their lanterns bobbing like ghostly fireflies. They moved slowly, almost ceremoniously, until they reached the center of the yard, right near the symbols. One of them, the taller man with a gaunt face and sunken eyes, knelt and placed something on the ground. I couldn't make out what it was at first, but when he stepped back, the lantern light illuminated it. It was a note, a folded piece of paper, weighted down with another bundle of twigs. I felt my stomach drop. Rachel whispered, "Do we call the cops?" But I shook my head, unsure if that would make things worse. The group lingered for a moment, standing perfectly still, their faces turned toward our house. It was as if they were waiting for something, or someone. I felt exposed, like they could see us watching them even though we were hidden. Then, without a word, they turned and walked back to the Airbnb, disappearing inside. For a long moment, neither of us moved. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. Finally, Rachel broke the silence. "We have to see what it says." I didn't want to go out there, but leaving the note untouched felt worse, like giving them permission to keep doing whatever this was. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, Rachel close behind me. The air was heavy and cold, despite the warm spring night. When I reached the note, my hand shook as I unfolded it. The handwriting was jagged and uneven, as if it had been scrawled in a hurry. "Thank you for your participation. It is appreciated." Participation, Rachel hissed, peering over my shoulder. What the hell does that mean? I didn't have an answer. The words felt like they were burning into my brain, each one more ominous than the last. I glanced around the yard, half expecting to see the group watching us from the shadows, but the only sound was the distant rustling of leaves. My gut screamed at me to go back inside, to lock every door and window and pretend this wasn't happening. But before I could say anything, Rachel nudged the bundle of twigs with her foot. "Wait," she whispered. "There's something else." Underneath the twigs was another object, a small, carved figure made of what looked like bone. It was crudely shaped, with deep grooves scratched into it, resembling the same symbols from the yard. I felt bile rise in my throat as I stared at it. "I don't want this thing here," Rachel said, her voice shaking. We need to get rid of it. I nodded, but as I reached down to pick it up, a sharp gust of wind blew through the yard, extinguishing our flashlight. Rachel yelped, grabbing my arm, and for a moment, the night seemed to close in around us, suffocating and impenetrable. We stumbled back inside, slamming the door behind us. My hands were trembling as I locked it, triple-checking every bolt and latch. Rachel was pacing the living room, muttering under her breath about how this wasn't normal, how we should have called someone sooner. I sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the note and the carving, which now felt like it was radiating something, an energy I couldn't explain. What do they want from us? I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. Rachel stopped pacing and looked at me, her face pale. What if it's not about what they want, she said. What if it's about what they've already done? Rachel's words sent a shiver down my spine. What had they done? What had we unknowingly participated in? My mind raced back to the symbols in the yard, the chanting, and whatever they'd been doing with that wooden box. It felt like pieces of a puzzle I didn't want to solve. I stood up abruptly, pacing now myself. We can't just sit here, I said. If we call the cops, at least it's on record. They can go over there and find what? Rachel interrupted. Some weirdos with candles? Symbols in the dirt? They'll think we're crazy, Sam. She wasn't wrong, but doing nothing felt worse. As we argued, a soft tapping sound echoed through the house. It took a second to register that it was coming from the back door, the one that faced the yard. Rachel's eyes widened, and for a moment, neither of us moved. Then it came again, louder this time. Up. I crept toward the door, heart pounding in my chest, and peeked through the small window. At first, I didn't see anything. Then my flashlight, which we'd left outside in the rush, flickered on by itself. Its beam pointed directly at the fence line, illuminating 4 figures standing just beyond it. The tall man raised his hand, almost like he was waving, but the motion was slow, deliberate, and unnervingly stiff. Rachel appeared at my side, her breath catching in her throat as she saw them too. What the? She started, but before she could finish, the flashlight flickered out again, plunging the yard into darkness. I bolted the door and grabbed my phone, finally dialing 911. My voice shook as I explained what was happening, leaving out just enough details to sound concerned but not unhinged. The operator assured me someone would be sent out to check the area, but it would take at least 20 minutes. Rachel and I sat in silence, gripping each other's hands, staring at the back door as if it might burst open at any moment. Every creak of the house felt amplified, every shadow more menacing. By the time the knock came at the front door, we both jumped so hard I nearly dropped my phone. I crept to the front door, my heart hammering in my chest. Peeking through the peephole, I exhaled in relief. It was the police. A single officer stood on our porch, his flashlight cutting through the dark. I opened the door just wide enough to talk, unwilling to let the night fully inside. "Thank God you're here," I said, my voice shaky. "They're in the backyard. They've been trespassing, leaving these things." I motioned vaguely toward the kitchen where the bone carving and note still sat on the table. The officer, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, nodded and stepped inside. "Let's take a look," he said, gesturing toward the back door. Rachel stayed glued to the couch, her arms wrapped around herself, while I led him through the house. As we approached the door, I felt that same oppressive energy from earlier, like the air was too thick to breathe. The officer flipped the lock and opened the door with a casual confidence I envied. His flashlight scanned the yard, revealing nothing. The symbols were gone. The twigs. The carving. Even the dirt looked undisturbed, like it had been raked over. My stomach churned as I stumbled forward, pointing wildly. No, it was here. There were symbols, and they left a I cut myself off, spinning around to see the officer watching me with a raised eyebrow. "Sir, it looks like your yard is clear," he said, his tone polite but skeptical. "I'll take a look around the property just to be sure, but I'm not seeing any signs of trespassing." I wanted to scream. I knew what I'd seen, what Rachel and I had both seen. But arguing with the officer wouldn't help. He walked the perimeter of our yard while I stood frozen on the porch, Rachel watching me nervously from the window. When the officer returned, he shrugged. "No one's out here. Probably just some pranksters, but if it happens again, give us a call. I'll file a report, just in case." I nodded, hollow and numb, and watched him drive away. Rachel and I sat in silence after the officer left, the weight of everything pressing down on us. How could it all just disappear? Rachel finally whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't have an answer. I kept thinking about the figures at the fence, the symbols, the note. They couldn't have cleaned everything up that fast. Could they? The more I tried to rationalize it, the less sense it made. I suggested we try to sleep, though neither of us believed that was possible. The house felt alive with tension, every creak and groan sending my nerves into overdrive. At some point in the night, I must have dozed off, because I woke with a start to the sound of Rachel shouting my name. I bolted upright on the couch, disoriented, and found her standing by the kitchen window. Her face was pale, her finger trembling as she pointed outside. I followed her gaze, and my stomach dropped. On the patio, directly in front of the back door, was the bone carving. Only now, it had been twisted, reshaped into something more grotesque, its jagged lines curling unnaturally, almost like it was alive. Beside it was another note, folded neatly, glowing faintly in the moonlight. Against every instinct screaming at me to stay put, I opened the door and stepped outside. The night was still, unnaturally so, like the world was holding its breath. My hands trembled as I picked up the note, unfolding it carefully. The message this time was even shorter, but somehow more sinister. "You've seen too much." The words were written in the same uneven, frantic scrawl as before, but there was something different now. The ink was smeared, and the paper was damp, as if it had been left out in the rain, but the night was dry. I turned back toward the house, ready to tell Rachel we needed to leave, right now, but I froze in my tracks. Across the yard, just inside the Airbnb's window, a face stared back at me. It was the tall man, his expression blank, his eyes dark and unmoving. He didn't react when I saw him. He just stood there, watching, like he'd been waiting for this moment. I stumbled back inside, locking the door behind me, my breath coming in shallow gasps. "Rachel," I choked out, "we're leaving. Tonight." Rachel didn't argue. She grabbed her keys and started throwing essentials into a bag while I kept glancing toward the backyard, half expecting to see the group closing in. The air in the house felt suffocating, like it was pressing down on us, urging us to leave. Within 10 minutes, we were in the car, peeling out of the driveway. The headlights swept across the Airbnb as we passed, and for a split second, I saw all four of them standing in the front window, perfectly still, their faces blank. It was like they wanted us to see them before we left. We drove straight to a motel about 30 miles away, barely speaking the entire trip. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half convinced their van would appear behind us, but the road stayed empty. Once we were checked in, Rachel and I sat on the bed, staring at each other, both too shaken to sleep. "What do we do now?" she finally asked, her voice small and uncertain. I didn't know. All I could think was that we'd gotten out, at least for the night. The next morning, after a restless few hours of sleep, I called the owner of the Airbnb. I didn't mention the group's rituals or the carving. I just said there had been trespassing and odd behavior, and they might want to check on the property. The owner, a chipper woman named Cindy, sounded concerned but confused. "There shouldn't be anyone there," she said. "The last guests checked out 2 days ago, and it's not booked again until next week." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "No," I said, gripping the phone tighter. "They arrived Friday night. A white van. 4 people." Cindy paused. "That's not possible. I haven't had any bookings for this weekend." I hung up without saying goodbye, my mind spinning. Rachel sat across from me, watching my face. "What is it?" she asked. I told her what Cindy had said, and the color drained from her face. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Rachel whispered, "So who the hell were they?" "We never went back to the house. We hired movers to pack our things, paying extra to avoid setting foot on the property again. To this day, I don't know what we witnessed or what they meant by our participation. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that bone carving, those symbols in the yard, and the flickering lights from their lanterns. And I wonder if leaving was enough, or if they'll find us again someday." The host in the basement. I wasn't even supposed to be on this trip. My friends had planned this little getaway for months, but I only decided to join them last minute because I had a few extra vacation days to burn. The house looked amazing in the photos. Big, cozy, and secluded, which sounded perfect. The host's listing said it was entirely ours for the weekend, no shared spaces, no other guests. It felt like a steal, honestly. We got there in the late afternoon, and everything seemed fine. The place was exactly as advertised. Spacious, clean, and with this rustic charm that made it feel like we were really escaping the city. There was even a welcome note on the kitchen counter with some local restaurant recommendations. Nothing felt off at first. That night, after a few drinks and card games, we all decided to call it a day around midnight. The house had 4 bedrooms, so we each picked one. Mine was at the end of the hallway upstairs, furthest from the staircase. I'm a light sleeper, and I'd been tossing and turning for what felt like hours when I heard what I thought was one of my friends walking around. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe someone needed a drink of water or a midnight snack. But the footsteps didn't sound casual. They were slow, deliberate, like someone was trying not to make noise but failing. I sat up in bed, trying to tell myself it was just the old house creaking, but then I heard a soft click, like a door closing. I grabbed my phone and checked the time. 2:47 a.m. Everyone should have been asleep by then. My heart was pounding, but I told myself it was nothing. Still, I couldn't shake this weird feeling, so I decided to quietly peek into the hallway. I cracked my door open just enough to see out, and that's when I saw it. There was someone standing near the far end of the hallway, closer to the stairs. They were partially hidden in the shadows, but I could make out their shape. It wasn't one of my friends, I was sure of that. Whoever it was, they were barefoot, wearing dark clothes, and they stood completely still, almost like they were listening for something. I froze. My first instinct was to grab my phone and text the group chat, but I was terrified they'd hear the sound of typing. After what felt like forever, the figure moved, walking back toward the stairs. The way they walked sent chills down my spine. It was slow and deliberate, like they knew every creaky spot on the floor. I waited until they were completely out of sight before closing my door as quietly as possible. My mind was racing. If it wasn't one of my friends, who the hell was it? And how did they even get inside? The house had a smart lock, and we were the only ones with the code. I didn't sleep after that. I sat on my bed, clutching my phone, trying to convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing. At around 5 a.m., I finally heard movement from the other rooms. My friend Jess was the first to come out, so I immediately stepped into the hallway and told her what I'd seen. She brushed it off at first, saying it was probably one of us wandering around, but I could tell she was spooked when I insisted it wasn't. By the time everyone else was awake, we decided to check the house, just to be safe. We started with the upstairs, then moved downstairs, searching closets, under beds, even behind furniture. Nothing seemed out of place. But when we got to the basement door, I realized something strange. The door was locked. Not just locked, but bolted with a heavy padlock. None of us had noticed it the day before because it was tucked behind a curtain near the laundry room. Why would an empty house have a locked basement? I asked. Nobody had an answer. Jess suggested it was probably just storage for the host's personal belongings, but the uneasy feeling in my gut told me otherwise. That was when Danny, the most skeptical in our group, suggested we message the host. He figured we were overreacting, but agreed it was weird enough to check. I texted the host, asking casually if there was any reason the basement door was locked. Their reply came almost immediately. Please don't worry about the basement. It's just storage. The reply didn't sit right with me. It was too quick, like they had it ready to go. Still, we tried to brush it off and go about our day, but the tension lingered. By evening, everyone was on edge, so we decided to stick together in the living room instead of splitting off into our rooms. We joked about being paranoid, but I could see it in their faces. None of us were really laughing. As the night went on, the weirdness escalated. At one point, we heard faint shuffling noises coming from below us. The floorboards creaked just slightly, like someone was moving slowly in the basement. Jess turned off the TV, and we all sat there, holding our breath, listening. Then came a distinct, deliberate sound, a knock. 3 soft taps from the basement door. No one moved. Danny, who had been the first to dismiss everything, finally whispered, "What the hell was that?" I grabbed my phone to call the host, but they didn't pick up. That's when Jess decided she'd had enough. "We're opening it," she said, grabbing a kitchen knife for good measure. The rest of us reluctantly followed her. Danny grabbed a flashlight, and we all stood by the basement door, staring at the padlock. That's when Jess noticed something none of us had. The padlock wasn't actually locked. The bolt was in the loop, but it wasn't secured. Whoever had been down there could come and go as they pleased. Jess hesitated, her hand hovering over the lock. "Are we sure we want to do this?" she asked, her voice shaking. None of us answered, but the silence said enough. Slowly, she slid the padlock off and pulled the door open. A wave of damp, stale air hit us immediately. Danny shone the flashlight down the stairs, revealing a steep, narrow staircase leading into total darkness. It didn't look like a normal storage area. The walls were unfinished, and the steps were covered in what looked like dirt or old sawdust. Jess was the first to descend, and the rest of us followed closely behind, our footsteps echoing in the cramped space. The basement was larger than we expected, but it was freezing and smelled like mildew. There was barely any furniture, just a small table and a single chair in the center of the room. A thin blanket was folded neatly on the chair, along with a mug and a half-empty bottle of water. It was obvious someone had been living there. The worst part was a small door in the corner that looked like it led to a crawl space. Danny walked toward it with the flashlight, muttering, "This is so messed up." Just as he reached for the handle, we all froze at the sound of a loud creak from above. Footsteps. Someone was walking around upstairs. We stood there, paralyzed, as the footsteps grew louder and more deliberate. They were moving slowly, pacing back and forth above us. Danny turned off the flashlight, plunging us into near darkness, but it didn't help. Whoever was up there had to know we were in the basement. The door was wide open. Jess whispered, "What do we do?" But no one had an answer. Then the footsteps stopped, right above the basement stairs. It was so silent we could hear each other breathing. I wanted to scream, to do something, but fear had me rooted to the spot. Suddenly, the basement door slammed shut with a deafening bang, and we all jumped. Jess yelped, and Danny scrambled to turn the flashlight back on. The beam of light swung wildly as he pointed it around the room. "We need to get out of here now," he hissed. We bolted up the stairs, nearly tripping over each other in our panic. When we reached the top, we found the basement door locked from the outside. Someone had locked us in. Jess started pounding on the door, screaming for help, but whoever was out there didn't respond. The only sound was the faint shuffle of footsteps retreating down the hallway. We were trapped. Jess kept pounding on the door, yelling, while Danny and I scanned the basement for any other way out. The small door to the crawl space caught my eye again, and a horrible thought crossed my mind. What if that was how they were getting in? I pointed it out to Danny, who reluctantly opened it. Inside was a narrow tunnel that seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions. The air was damp, and the walls were covered in cobwebs. It wasn't an exit. It was more like a passageway someone had been using to move through the house unnoticed. Jess turned to us, pale. "There's no way this was just for storage," she muttered. That's when we heard it again. Movement, but this time from inside the basement. Something or someone was down there with us. The flashlight flickered as Danny swung it toward the far corner of the room. For a split second, we thought we saw something move, just a shadow, slipping out of sight behind a stack of boxes. "Hello," Danny called out, his voice shaking. No response. Then, out of nowhere, the boxes toppled over, crashing to the floor. That was it. Jess grabbed the knife she'd been holding and started slashing at the door lock, trying to break it. I pulled out my phone and called 911, whispering frantically into the receiver. The operator could barely understand me, but I didn't care. I just kept repeating, "We're trapped, someone's here." As Jess kept hacking at the lock, I heard something that made my blood run cold, a low, raspy breathing coming from the crawl space. Danny and I turned toward the small door at the same time, and I swear I saw a pair of eyes glinting in the darkness before disappearing. "It's in there," Danny whispered, backing away. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there frozen, but my body wouldn't move. Then, as if on cue, the door to the crawl space began to creak open, inch by inch. That was when Jess let out a desperate scream and finally broke the lock. The door flew open, and we all scrambled out of the basement as fast as we could. We didn't stop running until we were outside, standing in the driveway. Jess was sobbing, Danny was pale as a ghost, and I couldn't stop shaking. My phone buzzed, and for a second, I thought it was the police, but it was the host. Their message was chillingly simple. "Please leave the property immediately." That was it. No apology, no explanation. Just an order to get out. We didn't need to be told twice. We piled into the car and sped away, leaving everything behind, including our bags. When the police finally called back, we gave them the address and explained what happened, but they didn't seem to take it seriously. By the time they got there, whoever, or whatever, had been in that house was long gone. We never went back for our things. The host stopped responding to our messages after that night, and the listing disappeared from the site within a week. We tried to piece together what had happened, who was in the house with us, and how long they'd been living there, but nothing made sense. The thought that someone had been sneaking around, watching us, maybe even planning something worse, still haunts me. Danny went down a rabbit hole researching similar stories, but all we found were vague accounts of off-limits basements and creepy hosts, nothing concrete. To this day, I don't know who or what was in that crawl space or why the host lied about the house being ours alone. But the worst part? A few weeks after we left, Jess got a package at her apartment. It was her bag, the one she'd left in the house. Everything was still inside, except for her phone charger and her spare set of keys. Whoever sent it didn't include a note. We changed our locks and blocked the host's number, but I still can't shake the feeling that this isn't over. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, I hear faint creaking, like footsteps in a hallway that shouldn't be there.